So they've told you it's terminal, and
Yeah. Yeah, he told me, the doctor said, I got some bad news. May as well just say it, you're terminal. And I said, how long have I got? And he said, till the middle of the week, maybe the end. Maybe the end. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Sugarloaf Mine.
okay, hold on. So before you do, so I just recently did a video, and it was about the Trapper's Gold, the Sugarloaf Gold Mine, and you know, it had to deal with your family, and you have the correct, or you have some you know, more information that wasn't quite right, or we didn't know about, and so with that, take it away.
Well, Johnny Rasmussen came up from old Mexico, as Dad would say, and I found 2 or 3 articles in the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune, and I don't remember the time frame. It was around 1910, 1915, in that time frame. And but those 2 newspapers, they interviewed him, and what he was doing, and he started out going to Bishop Coyle over at Santaquin, or at Salem, and he felt that things didn't match up to the description that Johnny gave in his story.
Who was that? Was that Lars Olson?
That was Lars Olson. Lars Olson. He was a neighbor of my grandfather's. And he told Johnny that he ought to see Ben Bullock, that he had a property down by Santaquin that he felt fit the description better. So he got a hold of my grandfather, whether it was in Provo or over at Spring Lake, I have no idea. And a lot of that's in the story that my dad wrote. But my dad put that story together for Hart and Bev and me. David wasn't born yet. Bev's my sister and Hart's my brother. And he'd tell us stories at night. So anyway, he typed up that story.
So if it hadn't have been for your family, we wouldn't have known about that at all.
No, you're right. I'm just trying to think, and I keep losing my thinking. Anyway, he got a hold of my grandfather, and they went over to Spring Lake, and everything fit, except there were no cedar trees. And Grandpa told him, hey, the pioneers cut all the cedar trees. They used them for fences. They used them in the construction of their barns and their homes. And so they decided, the other thing that fit, that wasn't in the last story you just did, when the trappers were trying to escape, they went up into the foothills south of Spring Lake where the Indian encampment was. As they were doing that, a band of Indians came out of they call it Yellow Rock Canyon over there. And Yellow Rock Canyon is about, a mile and a half south of Spring Lake. And it's very predominant if you're riding along the freeway or the highway there. and you look right down the foothills, there's a canyon, and that rock is as yellow as can be. But that's where the band of Indians came out. So that made the trappers go higher up the mountain, higher up the foothills. And they saw the badger come out of the hole, or they saw the badger hole, I don't know which. And they crawled into that. But one of the Indians from the band that came out of Yellow Rock Canyon shot one of the trappers with an arrow. And they lived in that cave for approximately 3 days. And during that time, the trapper died. One of the trappers died. The other two, they used a rat's nest to build a fire in there. And their story was that it was just filled full of gold bars. Now, those gold bars, I've heard they weighed 40 pounds. I heard they weighed 70 pounds. I've heard they weighed 10 pounds. We don't know. But they decided, when they came back, when the trapper died, they decided to make a coffin out of gold bars for him. And so they piled those gold bars up. And then when they left, they were going to each take a gold bar with them. And this leads me to think that the gold bars were probably in the 40 to 70 pound range, probably closer to the 40. But they were going to each carry a gold bar, and they didn't have horses. They'd lost them. And they decided that the bar, it was too heavy to carry a bar back to the Great Salt Sea. So anyway, they didn't take a gold bar. Instead, they made a map and wrote the story, the description of it. And that's what Johnny Rasmussen had.
And how did he end up with it?
His grandfather or great-grandfather was one of those trappers that was in that spent the 3 days in that cave. So anyway, when his great-grandfather died, he was going through his things and he found it, and that's when he decided to come to Utah. Now, the other thing in that story was, as I looked at it, it looked like they were right down just above the road where that gentleman said they were plowing. They decided, they formed a company, and that was my grandfather, I think Lars Olson, and probably Johnny, and others, to get some money to see if they could find that gold. And first of all, they rode on horseback looking for it. They couldn't find it on horseback. My grandfather used the willow witch to look for ore bodies. He'd use the maple from the maple trees, and he'd also use the what do you call the trees out here with the pine cones? Not pine cones. The
Pinions?
No, the
acorns.
Acorns. Yeah, he'd use those, but they'd pick locations that his dowsing rod would go down, so that it could be here, it could be here. And so they marked those locations, and then they got horses and plows around those locations, and they'd plow the hillside trying to find the the cave. And they didn't find it that way, so they picked what they felt, the majority of them felt, was the best location. And that's where the Golden Relief dump is. And they drilled a hole going east into the mountain, and then they turned to the right, and they skirted the inside of the mountain. So if the hill comes down like this, and this is all the dirt in here, this is air out here, they came through and then they would go around the mountain this way, trying to stay just under the surface, looking for it. I had some photographs of that cave, of the Golden Relief mine, that were taken in the early 1950s. My grandfather said, I think we ought to open that up again and see if we can find anything in there. And so my dad and Hart and I were living in the shed down just below that. And we went up there, and there was a dam that the farmer had the water rights on it, had dammed it up. So we talked to him, could we take the dam out, let the water run out? And he was using it to water his livestock and his cherry trees. And there's a pretty good stream of water that came out of that tunnel. And he made a dam out of 2x8s, 2x12s, I don't remember. But we got picks and we loosed that and we pulled the boards up and it let the water out. And we let that water drain a couple of days until the water was gone. And then we started to walk back in that tunnel, and it was up above our knees in an iron silt. Just a lot of iron in that tunnel. And we started walking back in that tunnel, and it was just so hard to walk in. So we waited until we went home, came to Provo, we got our fishing boots and went back up. And we walked back in that tunnel, and I can't tell you how far it went back, maybe 500 feet, something like that. But as we walked back into it, it got more and more beautiful. There were stalactites and stalactites that were just that heavy iron looking. And some of them had grown together. Others were just hanging down, and others, where the water dripped, they were just shooting up. And my son has those photographs and the type story that my dad did. But we thought that tunnel is too beautiful with all those stalactites and stalagmites to go in there and tear them up to go in there and clean it out and make the tunnel. And so we took pictures with a Polaroid camera and showed to my grandfather, Ben H. Bullock, and he agreed that was a beautiful tunnel.
So is that his mine in the beginning? Is he the one that put it in there in the first place?
Well, it was the Golden Relief, the Golden Relief Mining Company is what they called it. And Grandpa was the president of it. And they got stockholders that had heard the story and were interested in it. And they bought stock in it. A lot of them just agreed to work on it. But they kept looking for it, they couldn't find it, and finally they gave out. So if you go up there, and did you go up to the Golden Relief dump?
I'm not sure where the Golden Relief dump is.
There'd probably be a little pool of water outside of the workings, but they've gone back in there and cleaned that out. They've
Who cleaned it out?
the tunnels. I think it's the new owner.
Oh, have they?
They've got that orchard in there.
Because I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Matt Paulson came to see me a couple of years ago, and he's got a paper. They have been to every tunnel on the west side of Dry Mountain, and they had listed all of them. I had, for all the years we spent over there, I had no idea there were that many tunnels.
Really?
And
A lot over there, huh?
a lot of tunnels.
Wow.
But anyway, they tried to go back in that, and that tunnel was totally filled in right to the mouth of that tunnel. You'd never know there was a tunnel there. It just filled up with that iron. So maybe somebody's cleaned it out, but 2 years ago it wasn't.
Up above there, just behind it and to the left a little bit. Last time I was there, you could almost put a little cabin up there. I think that's where we were looking for the gold. Some treasure hunters from Las Vegas, and we didn't find any indication of it with the sensors that they used. Since then, someone's gone up there and pretty much cleaned it out and leveled it, and looks like they could put a cabin up on it.
Just above the Golden Relief.
Yeah.
When you're facing the tunnel, which direction did they level it off?
North.
North.
To the left a little bit.
Because there's a fellow named Tony that contacted me several years ago, and he can read old Spanish and Indian writings. He's very good at it, and he found writings over there, and he'd heard about the Trapper's Gold again, as I call it. And he was looking for it, and he had an instrument too, and he put it just above and to the right when you're facing the Golden Relief Tunnel. And there was a big stone up there that was kind of triangular shape. It's longer than that hospital bed. And he said if you lift it up, that he felt that's where the entrance to the cave was. So I went up and I looked at it and laughed, because that was about 20, 30 feet off our property. It was on Lyman's property.
Lyman.
Yeah. And so they went down to Lyman's, and that Tony did, and he talked to them. But somebody told me that Lyman's had gone up there before they sold their property, and they had moved that rock, and they'd used I don't know what they used, a backhoe or whatever to flatten that off up there. But my understanding it would be, I'm going to say 50 feet above the Golden Relief dump. If you go from the highway, like you were going to go up to the Syndicate mine. Have you been in the Syndicate mine? Oh, you're missing it.
I think I've been to it, but I haven't been in it.
Yeah, you can't get in it now. You'd have that Matt Paulson, he and some guys, they spent several hours digging so they could go back in it. Then they explored every tunnel back in there. Really an interesting man. every weekend they go out and they explore caves in Utah.
Really?
And he puts them on Facebook. His adventures, but they've got a bunch of them. They explore those. But when he went back in the Syndicate mine, because the Syndicate had a big opening to it. It was almost as wide as this room is long. And they had an air compressor over in this corner. The track went back in over on that side. There was an air compressor. They stocked their gasoline for the winter outside, just under that cover. They just blasted out. It was like a grotto. And if they quit working it for a while, and you get a storm, the rock above it and the overburden would come down, and it would cover that up. And every couple of years, they'd go up there and they'd have to dig all that out. And there was a fire up there east of Santaquin. It started kind of down low, but when was that fire, Dave? 5 years ago?
Longer than that.
Longer?
Probably more like 8, 9 years.
Okay. Anyway, it burned that side of the mountain. And then in the spring, they had a flash flood. And that Yellow Rock Canyon I was telling you about, it's yellow down the bottom, but it was the roadway to go up to those mines, and then it ended at the Syndicate mine. And the water came down the canyon that turned into Yellow Rock Canyon, bringing all that overburden with it, and it got down to the Syndicate dump, which was a big dump. And it turned and put water back in that tunnel, and it pretty well filled it. Oh, if you tried to get back in it, you had to crawl the first little bit, then you could duck walk, and then you could bend over and walk until you got back around the first bend. Then you could stand up and walk. But how did I get onto that from the other one? You got to excuse me,
That's all interesting. That's all right.
Yeah, my mind isn't working too good. I got this bad infection in my leg, and it's gone to my heart, and it's killing me. In fact, I was supposed to have been dead by a weekend ago, and I'm still here, but I get confused.
How you feeling? All right? Are you feeling terrible? Are you feeling?
You know,
it's got to be tough on you mentally.
I feel good when I'm just sitting.
Yeah.
Okay, I stand up and the pain is just terrible in my knee, and I try to walk. I take a step, and it just kills me. And yesterday the nurse came to give me a shower, and I got to where you are, and I had to stop. I just couldn't go. I said, "You're going to have to give me a sponge bath." So we backed up to the bed there, and I got a sponge bath. But I just can't get out of this room.
So you were talking about the Trapper Treasure.
Yeah.
Maybe we should mention that Dad ran a couple other tunnels, right? One on the left and one on the right of the original Golden Relief mine.
Yeah.
The one on the left, I don't know why they gave up on that. maybe you have a better idea of that. But then they went in over on the right where the Grandpa had the doodle bug, the dowsing rod.
Yeah.
And he felt that it was to the right. As a matter of fact, when I was about 8 years old, he took me up to this spot and he pointed straight down and he said, "Dave, the trapper is buried under gold bars right there." And that's why they built or ran the third tunnel, was to get in and find that trapper in the cavern. And it's interesting, but Dad ran that tunnel and he started skirting around just like the Golden Relief original one did. But he, after blasting one time, there was a gold nugget in the end of that tunnel.
Oh.
Really?
And he refused to remove it or even to go and do any more work because he didn't want to be accused of salting the mine. But there was proof that there's gold. And it was right there in front of his face.
Really?
And he took me back in the mine and showed it to me.
Really?
So, yeah, there was a gold nugget. And
Where was that tunnel from? How far from the Golden Relief?
That's the mine that's to the right. Just about, what, 40 feet?
Well, the original Golden Relief's the one that had the water coming out of it. Okay. And then they did that other tunnel.
Then you just go to the right about 40 feet. He ran another drift in.
Well, to the left about 40 feet.
That's the second tunnel. Well, maybe the third, because he had also a powder magazine back there.
Yeah.
And that caved in. And he said there's a couple of 100 pounds of dynamite back in there. And we were always a little bit nervous about that exploding. But it never has. But the tunnel to the right is where he found that gold nugget.
How big was the gold nugget?
Oh, it wasn't bigger than a dime.
But it was
yeah.
That's pretty good for Utah.
Now, he ran another mine back in over, I'm forgetting, Cedar Fort and beyond. And they were working in that mine, and they found the gold nugget in that mine, and that's when I first got a true view of what gold fever is.
Yeah.
I think his name was Von Hales, and he worked with my dad out there, and that guy danced and shouted and hooped, and he was the most excited man I ever saw in my life. He almost to the point of his being crazy. But yeah, gold can do crazy things that you don't think would happen until you find it.
I've seen it.
I don't remember the tunnel. I just remember 2 tunnels on that Golden Relief dump.
Huh.
Don't remember another tunnel there.
So back to the story, I don't know if it's true or not, that Johnny Rasmussen left to go back home, but he kept in contact with your grandfather and wrote a few letters.
I don't know. If it's in that story Dad wrote, then he did it. But I haven't read that for so long, I can't remember.
And you don't remember coming across any of the letters from Johnny or anything?
No.
In your family
Dad was a keeper. He kept record of everything, so it'd be hard to believe that he would have discarded those letters.
Well, if he had them, they're downstairs in that file cabinet, but I never found them. What I did find was those newspaper clippings in the Deseret News and the Tribune.
So 100% though, your grandfather was a 100% believer that Johnny Rasmussen was telling the truth.
Oh yeah.
There, he spent a lot of time, a lot of money.
Yeah, they spent a lot of time, and they drilled the hole back in there, and they hit the water. It was a bitter water. We used to take our pennies and dimes, silver dimes, and they had the dam, but some would leak out and it'd go across the dump. So when we'd go up to the syndicate in the morning, we'd drop a handful of coins, and then when we'd come back that night, we'd take them out, and boy, they were shiny. They
Really?
were right out of the mint.
Really?
Yeah.
Also at the Golden Relief, how much charcoal did they uncover there? Like a wagon?
It was a wagon load.
Yeah.
A wagon load of charcoal.
And it's, from what I understand, they'd heat the rock up with charcoal, and then they'd pour cold water on it, and it would fracture the rock, and they could dig it out.
They'd drill it with the old single jack or double jack. That's a drill. Single jack's one guy uses the drill and the sledgehammer. Okay.
And we're not talking a power drill. We're talking about a kind of a chisel that's got a little bit in it, and they'd hit it and turn it, turn it.
Yeah, and then pull it out. But then they'd put the rock down there, or the charcoal down there to heat it. And they wouldn't go very deep, because they'd want to, they'd go maybe so deep, and then they'd put the charcoal in it, and then they'd heat it, and then they'd throw the water on it, and that would fracture it, and then they'd pick it out. And that was one of the ways they'd mine.
Also, Dad told me that one of those areas out on the Golden Relief dump, he never dumped any overburden over this one area, because he said that's an ancient mine dump.
Really?
And I always wondered if that was an ancient mine dump. And when Dad bought that backhoe, I went up there and I dug into that ancient dump, and it really truly was an ancient dump. It was just full of fractured rock, and there was carbon in it. So I've seen the carbon, and I believe that's an ancient mine dump. So there were some workings there at one time.
When Hart and me started working over there, I was 12, and my brother Hart was 11, and we had a tent pitched on that mine dump. And then the miners, some of them, they were living down below, and they'd take the Jeep and they'd go up, and then we'd run from there and see if we could beat them up the syndicate. But we were always go along with a stick, trying to uncover a hole to see if we could find the treasure. But all I know, Johnny Rasmussen did come up, because there's newspaper articles of him being there. They formed the Golden Relief Mining Company.
So it was formed because of this gold story.
Yeah.
Johnny Rasmussen.
Yeah, that's it. They formed the company to look for it, and they worked the tunnels until they ran out of money, and then they'd stop.
So did Johnny get discouraged, or he just think, but he left and was going to come back?
We got to read that story. I don't have a copy here, because the best information I got on that is a story my dad wrote, and he got his information from his dad. And my grandpa Bullock, he'd talk about it sometimes. We'd go up there, and we were going across that dump one day, and there was a rattlesnake on the dump, and I had a BB gun. And he said, let's see how good that BB gun is. And he pushed the window open on the Jeep, and I gave it to him, and he shot that rattlesnake in the head till it died. And then we got out, and there was a little hatch that he carried in there, and he scooted the snake over to one of the railroad ties, and then he cut its head off. And he says, you got to bury those heads deep because that venom lives in them for a while. And so we dug a hole and buried the head. Then he had me put the snake in the back of the Jeep, and he said, we're going to have that for supper tonight. And then we got up to the syndicate. He got his knife out, and he skinned it just like he was skinning a fish, cut it open. And we cut the skin off, and so we had the meat, and then we took the skin and went in the cabin and got a thing of Norton salt, come out and spread it all over the inside and rubbed it in, and then he rolled it up. And he said, we'll make you a hat band out of that. So that night he made a, what do you call this, the spit?
Stretcher?
So we could cook the rattlesnake. We tied it on and ran it down where it cut it open, and then we kept turning it and turning it. Then when it got through, we just laid it out on a board there, and we just slice it about every rib. Well, it's not ribs, whatever they have. You know, you just slice it down pieces so thick. And we ate our rattlesnake that night. And it wasn't that bad. So.
Tastes like chicken.
I don't know if it tastes like chicken. It was a darker meat. But I mean, you could, if that's all I had to eat, I'd eat it.
So was there mining going on in that area before Johnny Rasmussen?
Oh, yeah.
Was your grandfather doing things there before? I guess he must have been doing things.
Yeah, I don't, the syndicate mine, I don't remember who owned that mine, but they had run a tunnel. And again, this is all double jack and single jack. And they had run a tunnel back. I don't know how much was Grandpa's and how much was the other guy, but I know we'd walk back into these big redwood water barrels, and that was probably back about a half mile, a third of a mile. I'm not good at distance underground.
Especially underground. But I'd say it's about a third of a mile.
Yeah, and that tunnel that would go back and went off to the right went back in a mile from the mouth of the tunnel to the end of it. And Hart and me went back in there once, and then Dad told us, he says, don't go back in there, that's cavey. He said, that'll cave in on you. So we never went again, but this Matt Paulson, he went all through it. They hiked, went through the tunnels, and they took oxygen bottles. That's what I was telling you before. They had to clean out the tunnel because the overburden was over it, and they didn't know if there'd be any oxygen. So they cleaned out enough they could crawl back in, and they had their oxygen bottles. I think there were 3 or 4 of them. They got back around the first bend, and they said they could breathe real good. And he had an oxygen meter, and that showed it was good, strong oxygen. So they went back through all of the tunnels in there, but there's a big cave that my dad hit in 1948, I think it was. And that when they went back in, after they'd blast on a Friday night, they would wait until the gases would come out, and then they would go back and get some samples. Well, they waited and waited, and no gases came out. Usually it'd be a blue gas would come rolling out. So he went back in there, and further back he got, there was a little breeze blowing at him. And pretty soon he got back, and he was looking up, and the top cut that they blew had air coming out of it. And so rather than come home, they made a ladder. Anyway, they climbed up, and they could look around in this cave, and they couldn't quite get in it, so they got a couple of sticks of dynamite, took it out of the wrappers, and they made a plaster out of it, and they put it on both sides, and then they ran a fuse to them, and that was enough to make it they could crawl up in this cave. And word got out, and a lot of people came up to climb in this cave. You could put this house in it.
Really?
Yeah.
And there must have been an entrance to the surface with the air coming through it, or not one that was visible, but
not one that was visible, but the cave went on down to different levels, and Hart and me, we'd climb down through them, and we'd always make sure that we could get out.
Yeah.
But there was always fresh air in there. So
did it look like it was a natural cave?
Oh, it was a natural. It was a natural cave. It sloped up and sloped down, and there's a big streak of white calcite over on one wall, and next to it there was a big streak of iron.
Didn't Dad build a trestle?
Yeah, they decided that they were going to go across it, and so they built a trestle across it, and we're drilling on the other side, and my dad was hard of hearing from a mine explosion in that mine. But he said he heard what he called it, the screech of 100 banshees.
Oh, yeah?
And he looked up, and the whole top came down, because it was like layers. But it came down, and it broke the trestle, and the mine cars and the mucking machine, everything they had on the trestle got buried up.
Wow.
And
He said when that started peeling away from itself, that's what made the noise.
yeah,
And that he started running to get out of the tunnel,
He
to
knew
get out
he-
of the cave, I mean.
He knew
And
what that noise was, huh?
so
Yeah.
he made it out of the cave, but the concussion of the cave-in knocked him off his feet.
yeah, knocked his helmet off.
Really?
The old hard hat, those whatever they were made out of it, it broke his hat, and one of the other miners with him, and anyway, they lost their lights, but they found on the other side they found the track, so they just followed the track out, and then they got more lights and came back in, but it buried their mine car and the mucking machine they had, and they decided they weren't going to do any more drilling, that jackhammer pounding away. So they went around it and kept on going.
We used to go in there when I was younger and set off fireworks.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a big cave, and
Yeah.
and it's a live cave, so it's always caving.
Yep.
Oh,
And
really?
it's half the size, maybe even less than that, is what it used to be.
So in this mine, they're mining it to look for the gold bars, or they're just mining it for
Now
gold? Oh, okay.
they were looking up on the surface above there. As you go up Yellow Rock Canyon, where it turns and goes up, up on the surface, they found high-grade silver lead ore. And so in the 1930s, they were mining that when I was born, in 1935. But when I say they, my dad, his brother, and two of my mother's brothers built a log cabin up there. And it was quite high on the mountain. The mountain goes up and then rounds off a bit, then up. And it was this portion here where they built the cabin, and then right here was the tunnel they were going back in. So they mined that, and it would be veins of silver lead ore, and so they'd dig that out. They'd dig out the pockets of the silver lead ore, and then they put them in gunny sacks or canvas sacks, and they'd stack them up outside, and then they had a horse that would pull would go down the mountain, and it would, what do you call those things you put behind the Indian ponies to drag? Yeah, Travis. And they built one of those, and then they'd put the ore sacks on it, and they would haul it down to the bottom of the mountain, what we call the Sagebrush Flats. Now, I think there's homes right there, and that Ace Hardware grocery store, or Ace Hardware store, is close to it. But they stacked it up and they just hid it in the sagebrush. And they never shipped the ore because they said there wasn't enough of it. So they decided to have that tunnel underneath it, and they were going to find the ore underneath it. And so after the war, they got a D8 cat to pull an air compressor, and they wound that around, and they were able to get it up to the dump. And they put it back in that overhang, and then they made a chariot out of an old automobile chassis, and they could put 2 barrels of gasoline and 2 50-pound boxes of dynamite on it. And then they had 2 horses would pull it from Santaquin up through Yellow Rock Canyon and all the way up to that mine. Well, the first winter, they decided that wasn't a good place for the compressor because it was cold outside. And so the next spring, they went back in the tunnel, 30 feet, 40 feet, and made a room off to the side, and they moved the compressor in there, and then they stored the gasoline outside. And then they ran a airline from the compressor up outside. So they do that so they could work there.
And they used propane to fire the compressor.
To fire the compressor?
They converted it to propane.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, because I know that Dad told me he came home and he was all kind of singed up. He didn't have much hair on him. And he had gone back in the mine in the morning, and he had his carbide lantern on, and he bent down to pick up a tool, and the whole tunnel went whoosh, and the propane had been leaking out of the canister, and he says that flame went shooting down the tunnel, and then it came right back at him.
Go downstairs. Come on, downstairs.
hadn't heard that story. That's interesting. So they had a propane tank up there,
Yeah.
and they ran the compressor on that.
Yeah, they had it. I think it was a dual system. They could either run gasoline or propane.
I went in the Army, so I don't know. I moved away. Telling that story, and that gave me a thought, the one we were telling earlier that I moved away from, and then I forgot it. Not a very good storyteller today. Grandpa bought that. He didn't buy it. He traded a man that had a mine. If you go over to Genoa and then into Alberta on your way to Eureka, as you start up the mountain, there's a dirt road that takes off to the left and goes to the Bergman mine. And my granddad owned that mine.
Really?
And he traded it for the Syndicate mine.
So somebody else was already mining it?
Yeah, they were mining it, and they'd run some of the tunnels. And I'm guessing this was around 1905 to 1910 time frame. It was in that time frame. And
did he ever get anything out of the mine?
No. Nope.
They thought there was something there?
Well, they were trying to hit that vein where the ore was up on top on the surface. They were going underneath, and they wanted to get that. There were a few places that they had some good outcroppings on the surface, so they would run underneath those.
But the mine he traded off, they made millions.
Millions, yeah. Kennecott Copper made millions of dollars off of it. Yeah, he just wasn't meant to get rich. No, wasn't meant to get rich.
Chief Blackhawk, I guess, grave was up there at one.
Someplace around here. Do you have a picture of them lifting him out of his grave?
No.
My grandfather was working that mine, and his wife's sister was living as a young girl. She lived down in that village. All of her sisters did. And when Black Hawk died, they had a funeral procession for him. They buried him in his blue army coat, and they took him up, and it's below the Syndicate, and to the north of the Syndicate, there was a big talus slope. And that's where it was said that he was buried. So anyway, the girls had told my grandfather about that. That'd be his sister-in-laws. So they were living on the Syndicate dump, the miners, and after work, they'd go looking for Black Hawk. And they got over there and they found his grave. And they moved the rocks, and anyway, they took him out, and when they lifted him out, there must have been four, because three were lifting him out, and one took the picture. But as they picked him up, his head came off. And so one of them had his head, and then the other two picked him up. But his feet were pulled up against his chest, and then he was bound. They'd bind him so his arms and his feet were pulled together. I can't bend my leg, I'd show you. Bend your leg to your chest, David.
I already got it.
Yeah. But that's the way he was buried. And so they...
Now, was he buried with his horse or a saddle? Do you remember anything about what he had?
I know he had a saddle. The Indians had saddles. He had a saddle. And he had saddlebags. He had a bow and some arrows. And I think that close by was the horse was buried. But anyway, they dug him out, and they took his body down to Spanish Fork to, I think it was J.C. Penney's, and they put his body on display at J.C. Penney's, and with the stuff they found, and they put his head back down in the socket. They displayed his body there for some period of time, and there was a lot of positive and negative comments about it. So they took it up to the LDS Conference Center, to the museum up there, and they had him on display. And I remember as a kid going up, and they'd made a special display case for him. You could look into it, and it said a story about Chief Black Hawk, and it had the things they found with him, and they were all laid out, and it was pretty interesting. And he was there for years, and then it wasn't politically correct anymore. And so the church put his body in a coffin, and they packed it away and took it out of the visitor center.
Chief Black Hawk was up there in the Temple Square, and then because it was... Now, the story I hear, and it hasn't been verified, but from what I understand, the representatives from Black Hawk's tribe came to the presidency of the church, and they wanted to know where their prophet Brigham Young was buried. Well, why do you want to know where he's buried? And the response was, so we can dig him up and put him on display like you have our chief on display.
Yeah.
And that's, from what I understand, is that caused them to take him out of display, and they probably stored him up in the granite. Don't
know where they stored him, but several years ago, when I say several, 20?
Probably.
There was a Boy Scout over in Spring Lake, and he was working on his Eagle project, and he decided he wanted to get Black Hawk restored to Spring Lake. So he worked with the city officials over there, and there's that park when you go into Spring Lake, and anyway, he got Black Hawk's body back in a coffin, and they made a cement thing in the park.
A marker, yeah.
Well, he's buried under it.
Oh.
Yeah, he's buried under that, and anyway, they had a big hoodoo. People came to it, and they celebrated. They were able to find a lot of his descendants, and they were there, and they had the county commissioners and the mayor of Payson and a lot of people go there, and they had an Indian funeral for him. And then they put him in the ground, and then they poured a big cement circle around him.
So where he was buried at, do you think there was a reason he was at a sacred spot, or just a convenient spot, or you have no idea?
I have no idea.
In rabble like that. It's more protective of a body when you. It's like a rock slide.
Yeah, it's
for
like a
every
rock
rock
slide.
you pull out, 3 will come back.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know where I guess his home was, the Spring Lake area.
He had a lot of homes because they moved around, but
Yeah, well, I'm just curious if there was a reason they picked that. Was it a sacred place? Did they know about the gold bars? Was they, I'm just...
don't know.
I remember my dad telling me that his mother is also buried up there.
In the rock slide?
Yeah, and so that could be a burial spot, but it's interesting. When I inherited Grandpa Ben H. Bullock's roll-top desk, he had all kinds of foofara in there. He had arrowheads, and there were a lot of buttons from a cavalry jacket. And they were even the little buttons, I guess the sleeve buttons. And I still got those, but I often wonder if those buttons didn't come off of Black Hawk's cavalry jacket.
Don't know.
So I remember you telling me one time, David, that possibly your grandfather was not regretful, but maybe spooked or something, that he disturbed Black Hawk's grave, or do you...
Well, that's my thinking. He never struck it rich, and it's almost like maybe he was cursed for digging up the sacred body.
And he wouldn't talk about it. He wouldn't talk about that, and I think he'd be very happy that Black Hawk made it back home.
Yeah.
I think he'd
So you
very.
think he was regretful about that?
I think so.
So your family, your grandfather, your father was involved in looking for the Lost
Yeah.
Roads mine. Tell me about that story.
My grandpa used to sit in his living room, and he'd use his willow witch, and then he and Harvey Fletcher Jr. got together, and he made a neat instrument that David's got out of welding rod.
Calls it his doodle bug.
Yeah, he called it his doodle bug. But they took a piece of rod and they made it shaped like this. It was like a M with the rounded corners, okay? So it goes up, then down here where it drops down, they welded a straight welding rod to it. So now you got something you can hold, and then it goes. Then on the end of it, he took went to the drugstore and he bought a bunch of little medicine bottles about so long. And some of them had corks you could put in the end, some you could screw a lid on. But he got one of those lids, and now you got your rod. So on the end of the Peter that stuck out, he shouldn't say that.
He had a cap.
Had a cap put on it, and then he took a clarinet box, and on that clarinet box he put a piece of board down the sides, and he drilled holes in them so these little bottles would fit in. And I'm going to tell you something he had pieces of gold, silver, lead, copper, zinc, bismuth, antimony, uranium, foreskin.
He also had a bottle, I still have it, and it's labeled Spirit of the Lord.
Oh. But he had a doctor friend gave him some foreskin, and people would come to him and say, we're going to have a baby. Can you tell me what I'm going to have? And he'd hold it up. And if it started to jiggle, or if he'd hold it here, if it kind of swung towards you and then jiggled, he'd say it's a boy. If he held it on you and it didn't jiggle, he'd say it's got to be a girl. And then when the baby was born, they'd come to him, "Oh, Brother Bullock, you were so right. We had a boy." Pat him on the back. Somebody would come and they'd say, "Oh, Brother Bullock, we had a girl. You told us we're going to have a boy." He says, "I'm sure I told you you were going to have a girl." "No, you said a boy." He says, "Well, I wrote it down in my wallet." So he'd take a piece of paper out of his wallet and he'd have Smith's girl. So he'd write their name and he'd put girl. He said, "I told you it was going to be a girl. I even wrote it down."
So how accurate?
And they'd get a big laugh out of it. But he had natural gas in it. He had oil. You name it.
Diamonds?
Yep. He had that in his bottle. And then he'd screw the bottle onto the end of the stick. He'd take it out and he'd hold it. And his thinking was that different people have different vibrations. And if he held that, and if he was out looking for water, in fact, one time the state president over at Spring Lake, not Spring Lake, Saratoga Springs, in that area, he called him and he said, "We've drilled a water well and we didn't hit water. And we think you can help us." So I drove him over there and he got out. No, we were in the field and he had me drive forward a little bit and then drive around, and then he'd open the door and he'd take his thing. And then he got out, and state president was there. He said, "You drilled on the wrong side of the fault." And he said, "What fault?" He said, "The maps didn't show a fault." And Grandpa said, "There's no water on this side that I get." But he said, "If I go over here," or was it deeper? It was deeper on one side and the other. He said, "If I go on this side of the fault," they went over there and then he'd hold it and go bing, 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 bing. And each time it bounced was it 10 feet, Dave?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 10 feet. So, he'd sit there and it'd bounce 100 times, so the water was 1,000 feet deep. And then he'd move to the other side of the fault, and bing, bing, it'd bounce up and down. And if it bounced 25 times, it was 250 feet deep. And he said, "If you come over here," he said, "I'd go a little further, and you drill your well, you're going to hit the water at 250 feet. He said, "If you stay on this side, you've got to go down 1,000 feet. And I think they were down 50 or 500 feet, I don't remember. Anyway, it was cheaper to move the rig over and bounce it. And then, but when he'd hold it, this was 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 10, 20, 30, 10, 20. So what it was doing, it would go down, then when it would go sideways, that's how thick it was through the water layer. So, and then it would go again down to the next water layer, and then how thick it was through the water layer. So anyway, they moved over and they drilled the well and they got good water out of it, about 250 feet.
Right, what he told them, huh?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yep.
So did he use that to help locate the Lost Roads mine thing then, or?
He would sit in his house and he would hunt for gold. He would just turn around and he'd say to my dad, I think we need to go out that way. He says, there's some gold and silver. And they'd get the maps out and they'd look at it and they'd say, yeah, let's go on this road and about 20 miles and let me take a bearing on it. Then he'd get out and he'd hunt around and he'd triangulate it that way. And it was thought that the gold that the Lost Roads mine was in the south face of the Uinta Mountains by some, because he was living in, but I think he was living in Camas at the time. And anyway, he would go look for his ore, and he would bring it back, and they had enough that it helped the church, plus they used the gold from that to gold plate the Angel Moroni on the temple in Salt Lake. So there were maps that were supposedly that he had drawn on his deathbed. Now there's two roads. There's Caleb and
Thomas.
Who?
Thomas.
Thomas. Thomas was the oldest, and he was the first one to do it. Then he passed it on to Caleb. And as far as I know, Thomas never told anybody where it was except Caleb. But Caleb told some of his family, and he drew these maps on his deathbed. And they were great, except it never gave a starting point. Yep, oh yeah, here I've got a map of it, and it's right here. Where do I start?
Yeah.
But he talked to his wife just before he died and whispered something to her, and the family knew what he whispered. And anyway, Grandpa had one of the maps, and he had determined that it was west of Moon Lake. So we went out there one Saturday. It was in the fall, beautiful weather, and we stopped at Moon Lake, and Dad took the Jeep as far up this stream as he could, and then pulled it out. And I remember Grandpa took out his instrument, and okay, it's that way. So we tried staying along the stream bank and going that way, but pretty soon it got too hard to do it. But there was an animal trail that turned and it went up just above the pine trees along there, so 50 feet high, something like that. And we followed that animal trail, and they got up to a place where they found a tree, and it said Oro, 18 something. I don't remember the date.
1850 something.
1859
or 54.
Whatever the date. Anyway, so they figured that Caleb had written on the tree, and then right down below it, my dad and Grandpa were excited because here's a mine shaft.
Oh, right below it, there was a mine shaft, huh?
Yeah. Now, to me, being 12 or 13 years old and knowing everything about mining, to me it looked like a pine tree had fallen over, and that hole was the where the roots had been.
Oh.
Okay.
So you was there.
Yeah, they took Hart and me. We went with them.
Okay.
Anyway, that's what it looked to me.
About what year was this?
let's see. I think I was 12 or 13. I was born in 35, so 58.
Oh, that's a long.
Huh?
Well, I think 58, I believe, is when the notice was in the Duchesne newspaper that Bullock found the mine. So, I don't know, you were 23 years old.
No, it was when I was a kid. That's when we first found it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But they a lot of talk about, is that the shaft or is that the stump of where the tree was?
And on the map, now Dad and Grandpa were going to buy that map. I think it was on a buckskin, some kind of animal hide. But in the course of negotiations, was it the wife or widow of Caleb?
The widow.
She had decided that she didn't want to sell it. So Grandpa got a piece of paper and he copied the map, and down on the bottom, I think you see this in Norm Thompson's book or one of those books. It says, this is as shown on the Rhodes map.
So that was
The original map.
copied down by your grandfather.
And I have that.
But anyway,
And there were 3 X's also.
yeah, I remember seeing those.
Apparently 3 different shafts.
So anyway, we left. Didn't do anything with it. Was that it? Wasn't it? And then next thing I knew, I was in the Army or going to school. I can't remember. And Dad sent me a copy of that article in the newspaper. And it was also in a newspaper out of Nevada, too. That Ben H. Bullock has released the discovery of the Rhodes mine. Now, I think that there were a lot of Rhodes mines. My own personal feeling is that the Indians knew where they were, and they had showed Thomas, and if he was living in Duchesne, he went to one. If he was living in Heber or Hill, what's that?
Daniels?
What's the town just north of
Camas?
Camas? Yeah, Camas. If he was living in Camas, he'd go from there too. And my friend Tony, he would agree to that. And he studied that for years and years. And
well, Dad, do you know if this is true or not? But what I hear, I seem to recall that he's the one who told me that he crawled down head first into this shaft that they found, and it was so narrow that it was obvious that either children or a woman or women ran that shaft, because it's all he could do to squeeze down in there. But he tied, from what I hear, he tied his one leg with a rope and tied the rope around a tree, and then he climbed down head first into that shaft, and he saw where the Spaniards or the somebody had chiseled off this vein of gold, but they didn't get it all. Right at the very end of it was a white quartz with a lot of gold in it, and he broke that off and brought it back out with him. And he used to go around the Lions Club and different organizations and show that gold quartz. And he said every time he'd do that, he'd pass it around and it kept getting
Smaller and smaller.
smaller. And so he decided to break it up and just have all that gold melted together.
So what happened then? If they found it, was it played out or?
I don't know. I didn't know they were working it because where was I when that happened? What year was it? You said the article was in the
Well,
paper.
I was 8 years old then, and you're 15 years older than me, so you're up and gone.
I was living in Vernal then.
Yeah. Now, what I understand is that they made the announcement that the Rhodes mine had been found because they found the tree, and they went. He hired a team of men to go up there and begin clearing ground and working so they could get into it. And when they went up there, my dad said that it was as though a bulldozer had come in there and tipped the tree over and buried up the mine shaft.
Yeah.
And Grandpa, Ben H. Bullock, he put his arm around the shoulder of his son and he said, "Let's go home, Dad," or "Let's go home, Vern. This is bigger than the two of us." And that's the story that I remember, that they were, at that point, I think, feared for their life because they were messing with something that was bigger than the two of them.
Afraid the Indians would get them.
Yeah. But I've got that map he copied, and he spent a lot of time up there doing the claims. He got 10 claims that he put in on that, but I've never been there. I have no idea how far it is from Moon Lake.
Oh, well, Grandpa had been in that wreck and broke his hip and was healing from that. They didn't do surgery on him then. And we kept taking turns hanging on to his back belt and walking with him. So Dad or Hart or me always had a hold of him, when we were walking. But it like I say, it got the stream got too rough, so that's what we cut up and along this animal trail, and that's where the tree was. But it was
Do you remember seeing the 408?
Oh yeah.
You remember seeing that?
Yeah, it was carved in there. They were really excited about it. We saw that before we saw the hole, but I just kept thinking that a tree had fallen over next to it, and the stump had came out. Then I got thinking about it, but there was no tree laying there.
Oh.
So, but that's what it looked like to me. Oh, a tree fell over, and here's a hole. We climbed down into it where we went. Now,
It kept on going, or was it caved in, or you couldn't tell if it was a stump or a hole?
it was climbed down like 10 feet, just to round it out in that mountain soil. And that's the part I saw. But I know he went back, and then who was it? One that went to prison.
Kerry Boren.
Yeah. He said that the Bullocks in their greed went out and destroyed it. And we took a bulldozer in there, and they knocked over the tree and they covered up the hole. Then Dad got the book and read it, and it really pissed him off because that happened. So he tried to get a hold of Terry. Kerry, isn't it?
Kerry.
Not Terry, it's Kerry. You're Terry, the other's Kerry. And he found out he was in prison through his publisher. And so he wrote him a letter about it. And he wrote a letter back to Dad apologizing. And which I hear a lot of these guys make accusations, to make their story better, and then they get called on it and they apologize.
So he wrote in his book that your family went in there, destroyed the tree, covered up everything so nobody else could find it.
Yep.
It simply wasn't true. Somebody went in there and did it, but it wasn't your family.
Yep. Dad said there was a oil well company working out there at that time, and they were making roads and trails in there so they could get their seismograph equipment in. But and then he wrote Boren wrote another book, and in that he quoted the letter from my dad to him.
What was that? Footprints, the first edition? Was that?
Footprints in the Wilderness, and then
Lost Roads Mine.
Was that by what? Pierce, Norman Pierce?
Well, Boren and another guy that wrote the one book.
I think it was Pierce.
No, it was Bourne and Gail Rhodes.
Yeah, Gail Rhodes. That's right. Boren and Gail Rhodes. They wrote it.
See, I think I remember you, David, saying, maybe I can't remember. I talked to so many people, but didn't you say your dad got lost? Or somebody got lost there for 3 days?
You remember that? Grandpa was waiting for him at the Jeep. And Dad got lost, which is easy to do up in the winter.
Yeah.
And I believe he was missing for 3 days. And Grandpa was, I guess, too infirm to really walk out of there. And
Yeah.
I don't know why he didn't drive. Maybe
Dad probably took the key. No, I missed a lot in those days because we were living in Vernal and Seattle and California.
So I know there was a story about your grandfather going, and I think I got it from you, David, that he went to Mexico and was looking for treasure.
Well, I
documents
remember
and
Grandpa put me on his lap when I was a little boy. I had to have been maybe 4 years old. And he told me that he had a description of where Montezuma's mine was, and or Montezuma's treasure. And that was a long time ago. I mean, 66 years anyway.
Yeah.
And so my memory fades, but as I can kind of recall, he had interpreted the writings of, it was a story told to a priest, a Catholic priest, and that it gave enough information that Grandpa and my dad, they started exploring down around, wasn't Moab.
Kanab, yeah.
Yeah, and they wanted to get a mining permission on some private property to go in there. And the way it was told to me that I remember by Grandpa was that the Aztecs, the porters, there were thousands of them. And there were also guards and soldiers, and they came up and they brought the treasure up into southeastern Utah, and they excavated, and everything that they took out of this huge hole they preserved. They took the topsoil, they took the plants, they took everything, and then they got down to bedrock and they mined into the bedrock and they made a cavern, and they put all of this treasure into this cavern, and then they put the stone back and he put the topsoil back and planted the plants back again. And I don't know, I think if I remember, he told me that most of those bears were sacrificed because they couldn't afford to have anybody go back or go anywhere and tell where this massive treasure was buried. So almost everybody was killed, and there was only the highest of the ranking leaders that were in that expedition that lived. And one of them told the story. I think, if I remember, he was a soldier, and he escaped. But he told the story to a Catholic priest of how that treasure was buried. And Grandpa knew where it was. But the owner of the property thought that they were after uranium and wouldn't give them the lease to the land. So it was a dead dog, and they didn't do anything with it. Do you remember anything about that?
I know that there's a lot of stories of Montezuma's treasure being hid down around Kanab.
Yeah.
Neil, you're kind of a treasure hunter then, got it in your blood, you're doing a little bit with somebody. You got anything you can share with us that's not divulging anything secret that you're working on, or somebody else that you're working with is working on? You got any good stories, not the locations, or some great stories? Or
how about that gold buried out at Chimney Rock?
Oh, we didn't find it.
what's the story of it?
Back in the 1800s, the stagecoach would go from Eureka to Cedar Fort or to Salt Lake, and anyway, it got held up by, and I don't remember, 2 or 3 guys. They held it up, and they took the gold box, and they had $38,000 worth of gold. So they formed a posse looking for the guys, and I can't remember if they caught 2 of them or 1 of them, but he said they had buried the box of gold under a large chimney, or under a large cedar tree with about 3 feet of chain sticking out. So they'd wrap the chain around it, and then they buried it, and they had just a chain laying on the ground so they could find it over by Chimney Rock. Well, that got out, and everybody started hunting for it. And nobody's ever fessed up to finding it. And back in 1952 or 53, we were working a mine north of Chimney Rock, right underneath Nutty Putty Cave. And in the Sunday newspaper, they used to have these supplements you'd pull out of the middle of it. It was an article on slick paper, and they'd have different stories, but they ran a story on that, and they had the newspaper articles about that robbery and where the gold was hidden. And Dad said, "I'll bet you that place is just swarming with people when we go over the mine tomorrow." And because we rode right by Chimney Rock, and then we had to turn north. And we got over there, and there were tents, there were trailers, there were campers. And the people out there, they were looking for that gold. So I think if anybody did find it, they would be smart enough to not say they found it. Because
where is Chimney Rock? Because when you said Chimney Rock, I'm thinking the Four Corners area, but
no.
Walking over here by Eureka then.
Yeah. You haven't been to Nutty Putty Cave, but you know about it.
Yeah.
There's different ways you can get to it. The way we would always go, we would go to Alberta, and then we would turn and we would go north to mile marker 7 on your way to Salt Lake. So we'd go 7 miles, and there's an intersection just past that 7 miles. And on the northwest portion of it, there's an old ranch there. You go by there now and it's a junkyard, old cars and trucks and stuff. But anyway, and right there, that junction you come to, it says Chimney Rock Pass. Okay? And if you take Chimney Rock Pass far enough, you go past. Anyway, that road goes west over to Cedar Valley, and there's the old road from Eureka goes up what they call Hommansville Pass. Just before you get in Eureka, there's a lime on this side of the road. But the old road goes up that pass, on down, and then it junctions against that Chimney Rock Pass Road. So Chimney Rock is between the old highway that went to Salt Lake from Alberta and the old highway that went to Salt Lake from Eureka. Roughly 5 miles. Good road, very good dirt road. And there's this big rock that sticks up that must be, at the top, 75 feet across, roughly. Down the bottom, you go around it. We shoot at it. That's a good place to shoot and not start fires. But my granddad always said when he hit ore over there, he was going to hollow out underneath that rock and make a dance hall for the miners.
Did you hear about that Broadway gold that was found in Santaquin? That guy was plowing up his garden and turned up some gold coins, and he called the police. They brought the feds in or something, but it turned out they brought metal detectors and they found not only all these gold coins, but the stamps. I guess it come from the Denver Mint. They stole the gold coins and the stamps that made them, and feds come in and seized it all there in Santaquin here.
How long ago was that?
Well, I'm going to guess 15 or 20 years ago.
I don't recall hearing about it. But if you go back 100 years ago, I remember.
What about that Nutty Putty Cave? Didn't you and Hart discover that? And do you think it had been found before that?
Again, a story I've told so many times that it gets off just a little bit. And I can't remember. I do know that Richard Dixon, Bob Hatch, and Jim Earl and Hart and I went over the mine. And we were over just south of and a little bit east or west of Chimney Rock. There's another mine my dad ran there. But it was during the Christmas vacation, and we were going to hunt rabbits, and it was so cold. But I think that the 5 of us were in the Jeep, and we rode through Rattlesnake Pass, and we looked up on the hill, and there was smoke coming out on the hill. And we thought somebody had was up there and built a fire, and we wondered if they were distressed. Either that or Dad did it and told us, and that's what I can't remember. Anyway, I've told the story so many times, and Dad's told it so many times. I can't remember if Hart and me saw the steam come out or whether it was Dad. But anyway, we went up there with Dad and the carbide light, and it was about 30 below. It was really cold. And this hole in the ground there's a pit there, and this steam was coming out. Enough to make it, when you look at it, you say, oh, there's a fire in there. So Dad decided to go down in it, and you climb down one end and you go down 6, 7 feet. Then you move over and then it drops down another 6 or 7 feet. And then a cave takes off to the north. And when Dad got down there, he said, whoa, rattlesnakes.
Oh, yeah?
2 big balls of rattlesnakes.
Oh.
And they were all wrapped around each other. And he came out of there and he said, don't you boys go down there, that's got rattlesnakes. And so I never went there looking for rattlesnakes, but that spring, my dad was up on top on that hill, and he found some silver. And so he and Grandpa got there, and they said, well, there's silver down here, so they decided to mine it. So about a third of the way up the mountain or hill, whatever you want to call it, it was kind of a flat place, good place to start a mine. So they started a mine to go after this silver. And they ran that for a couple of years. And they got back where it got real cavey. And it was cavey from that Nutty Putty Cave. The Nutty Putty Cave, that hill looking north, from the south looking north, you go up on the hill and it goes like this, and then this goes up and then down, and this goes down. And so about a third of the way up, they started this mine, and they ran it back in, and then we realized later on, when we found out there was a cave there, that that mine went underneath the cave. But nobody knew about the cave. We would be there all summer, and you wouldn't even see a rabbit hunter. But set up above that cave, when we found it, they'd made a winds go up. They had some pine trees and some pine trees with a log going across, and so they could turn it like, oh, we're going to go down this cave, and we're going to go back, and we're going to get rattlesnakes. Anyway, and then we looked on the maps, and the maps called it Windless Hill, Windless Hill.
Huh.
And several years later, I was married. I'd lived in California for 7 years. We'd moved back here. My brother and I took our oldest daughters and our sons, and we took some motorcycles and went over there and let them ride the motorcycles, and we'd drive in the truck I had. And we got over to that mine we ran, and my son said, oh, I've been here before. I said, you've been here before? He says, yeah, the scouts came over here. He says, we went down Nutty Putty Caves. I said, where's Nutty Putty Caves? Oh, he's on top of that hill. He said, there's a cave that goes down. And he says, they got maps of it. It goes all under that mountain. And he said, there's one they call the Birth Canal. He said, that is really tight. He says, you got to be little to get through that. And then we started seeing people when we'd go over there. And we'd go several times a year. We'd ride the four-wheelers and the motorcycles. And we'd go over there, and there'd always be a big bunch from BYU, have their tents set up. Utah Valley Community College, they'd get a bus up there, 4-wheel drive bus, and they'd go down through the Nutty Putty Caves. And we always told that people, don't go down there, there's snakes down there. And then that kid, Jonathan Johnson, see, I got a good memory. Jonathan Johnson was with the group, and they went there, and he got down in the birth canal head first, and he got stuck. He couldn't go forward, and he couldn't go out. And they called the sheriffs, and the sheriff's department came out, and they worked on him, and they couldn't pull him through, and they couldn't back him up. And he was there 3 days, head down, and he was dying. And they tried greasing him up, everything, but they couldn't get him out. And they ran a telephone line down there so we could talk to his wife. And his wife was outside talking to him. And then we ended up, he died in there. Wow. So they decided to close the tunnel off. And they buried him there, and they made a monument, and they put it in there, and had a picture of him. And here lies Jonathan Johnson, age such and such, and something about him. And they down in the cave where it flattened out, they drilled some holes going up and down, and then they took a steel post and they put those down in the ground, and then let's see, I can't remember how anyway, they put the post in there so they were stuck in between the top and the bottom, and they put holes across, and then in the middle they made a gate that was about so big, and you could get the key from the county sheriff or the Grotto Association. And then they decided that they were going to close it off completely. And 2 years ago we went over there. 3 years ago we went over there, and they had filled it up with dirt up above the level of the gate, and then they made another nice monument, and they cemented it into the limestone. And that was 3 years ago. And then 2 years ago, I took some guys from St. George that live in the same trailer coat as me in the winter, and we went over there, and somebody had shot his monument all up.
Terrible.
And so I called the sheriff's office and told them. And last year, we went over there. They'd taken white stones, average about this size. Some were bigger, some were smaller. And they made a fence out of these white stones around that cave. And it was about you'd say it's wider than this room, and about as long as from here to the front of my house. Really? And then on the west side of it, the stones didn't come together. They got about 8 feet apart, and then they turned and went out that way a little ways, out to the west. But they'd put 2 monuments up to him. They had one on the west side, one on the east side. And so the hole was all caved in, or all filled in.
So the first time you guys went in it, you explored it a little bit. It was just a cave, nothing, couldn't tell there'd been any human activity in there in the past? Or
you couldn't tell anybody had ever been in there, except there was that Windsor hoist over it. And we figured maybe that the sheep herders had made that for some reason. And then it went on, and then when that kid got buried in it, some guy said that he discovered it in 1970 something. Anyway, that he was the first person to ever, he discovered it. He was the first person to ever crawl back in there.
You seen it back in the...
And I don't know if he was or wasn't. I don't know if, I know that we didn't, the miners wouldn't go in there, but maybe the sheep herders went down in there.
Yeah, I remember in the syndicate when I was a little boy, I was about 4 years old. Because I was small, I could fit underneath this overhang inside the mine, and Dad wanted me to crawl up in there and tell him what was on the other side, because it was obvious it was a cave. And it was pretty close. You know where the Elephant's Eye Cave is? It's in the left tunnels going off towards the cave.
Okay.
And I...
Elephant's Eye, is that where they first discovered it? The cave? What do you call it?
The Elephant's Eye. And I think I've even got a picture of it. It did look like an elephant's eye. It's just all the formation.
Is it right up in the top right-hand corner?
It was off to the right and almost eye level.
Oh, I don't know that
But
one.
anyway, I don't really remember where it was in the syndicate mine, but I think it was he and Grandpa. They gave me a miner's hat and a carbide light and had me crawl up in there, and I squirmed on up into that thing and looked around, and
A lot of
it
rock.
wasn't very big at all and nothing dramatic. I didn't know what I was looking at, even if I did see something. But I'll never forget how afraid I was. Going
Yeah, 4 years old.
that on my belly and crawling up into that cave. And then there's that story about the water hole. You know where the water ran across the tunnel, and there's the cave.
Yeah, it goes down. Yeah.
And this Dad played a dirty trick on his miners. This hole was there, and they wanted to go down and explore it.
Let me back up a little bit.
Okay. I'll let you tell it, because I think
Okay.
it's better you're telling it.
When they ran this tunnel back in, they made a turn and off to the left, and they hit a cave, and the cave went down below, and they went down into this cave, and there was nothing there. So what they started doing, their muck, rather than push it outside, they'd just push it back, and they ran rails right over that cave that went down, and they'd dump their mine cars. They'd just dump their ore down there, or their dig them down there. Dad always, if it didn't have ore in it, it was dig them. That's 95% dirt and 10% hope, or 50-50 dirt, 50% hope. And anyway, they had that cave there. Then they turned, going back, so the tunnel comes, I'm going to go up like it's laying down. The tunnel comes in, it turned, here's where the cave was. They got over here, they turned, and they went up here. Well, years later, we were working back in the tunnel, and you'd light your fuses, and we'd walk a little ways out, and we'd just step in a side tunnel and go boom, boom, and it'd blow out your light most of the time. But we'd count the shots as they went off to make sure they all went. Then we light the light, we'd go out. Well, we got out to this place, and it had caved in. The tunnel had come down. And Dad looked at it, and he says, well, let's see if we can climb over. So we went up, and we climbed over and went down the other side, and we went out. So Now he's got this tunnel that turns with a cave in right here that comes down. So they had to just, goes up, and where it turns, they just started here and ran another tunnel up here, okay? And they got up there 15 feet or so, and they mucked out, and as they were mucking out, the dirt kept sliding down through this hole. And so they dug around it, and they said, hey, look at this. So here's a hole. And they picked on it, and it was Marv and Roy Yorks. Marv was the dad, and Roy was the son, and they lived in Santaquin. And anyway, they picked around the hole, and they'd look down it, and they said, why don't you go down there, Vern, and see what it looks like? So Dad says, go get me some rope, and I will. So they went outside, they got the rope off their horses and came back in. And Dad says, now I'll keep jerking on this rope, and you make sure I'm okay. So he crawled through the hole, and he went down, and they'd say, you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. And he'd jerk on the rope, and he'd go further. Yeah, I'm okay. Then he came up in this other cave. And so, you okay? He gave it a good tug on it. Yeah, I'm okay. And he really pulled it. And then he ran back and around, and it wasn't very far. And he comes up behind the guys, and they're saying, Vern, you okay? And he kneels down between them, and he puts his hand on his shoulders, and he said, what you boys looking at? And they turned, and here's my dad, scared him to death. And Roy York, the young man, he was superstitious. He really was superstitious. But he jumps up, and he's for running out of the tunnel, and Dad called him back. But when we were working that mine over by Chimney Rock, there was a water tank that the sheep herders had put in, and they'd go water to it, and then it had a thing on it. It'd open up, and it would go in the trough, so they'd have water to drink. So they let us rig up a thing so we could get water, because you use a lot of water in mining. So I'd take the Jeep and two 55-gallon drums, and I'd go over there, and it was kind of like the old railroad trains. You know, they had to pull up the water tower and get water to open. Anyway, I'd fill those 55-gallon drums, and I saw this man and lady, and they were each carrying a gallon glass bottle. And anyway, they were coming towards the water trough to get water. So they got there, and I got talking to them, and some guy in Salt Lake hired them to do assessment work on a piece of property he had out there. And all they were doing was living in the cabin he had and making it look like they were doing road work. And he dropped them off with enough food for 2 weeks and water, and he was going to be back. And it was in the 3rd week, they were out of water. They had rationed their food. So they'd walk down to this mine, and I imagine a round trip was 6 or 7 miles. So they'd get the water and go back. And so I put them in the Jeep, and I took them back up where they were staying, you know. And then everything they had up there they could put water in, we took it out of the 55-gallon drums and loaded them up, pans and pots and that, so they wouldn't have to go so often. And then I left them, went back, and I told them I'd tell my dad. And I went back, filled up with water again, went over the mine and told Dad. And so that evening, we went up to see him, and Dad took everything he could spare for his groceries. And so he took that up to him, and he talked to him and found out that Emmett was gassed in the First World War in Germany, had bad lungs, kind of a little guy. He was half Indian. I don't remember which tribe. And he met Esther, and they got married, and I thought she was older than him. And later on her birthday, we found out she was 30, or her 35th birthday, and Emmett was in his 70s.
Wow.
But the weekend when we left, we had the miners with us, so there was 4 of us in the Jeep, but we went up to that mine, and we got up there and they were gone. And everything they had was gone, so I don't know if they left on their own or they told my dad later on, but later on he wanted watchmen to be over there at Santaquin, at the camp we had there just as you go out of Spring Lake. And some way he put an advertisement in the paper, and they read it, and they called him. And so he went to Salt Lake and got them and all their belongings, and he took them out to the cabin. And we used to call the cabin, Emmett's name was Emmett King. So they lived in the King Castle. And Esther was the queen, and the outhouse was the throne. But they lived for several years, and Dad would buy their groceries and pay him something a day, $2 a day or something like that. But they got all their groceries, and he'd buy them stuff to read, or he'd go to the library, and Esther didn't know how to read. Emmett wouldn't teach her, so Dad taught her how to read and how to write. But
she was the sweetest lady. She was really a sweetheart.
Yeah, she wasn't very bright.
No.
But she called me one night and said, "I tried to call your dad, nobody's home. Emmett's been bitten by a rattlesnake." And he said, "He's gone to town." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." She said, "He was bitten by a rattlesnake, and he came in and had me heat water, and he had a bath in the wash tub, and he was going down to find a doctor." So I knew it was Thursday night, and that was Lions Club, and my dad was at Lions Club. So I went down to Lions Club, and I got him out of it. And I said, "We got to go over to the mine." And Esther said Emmett's been bit by a rattlesnake. So anyway, we went over there, and she's just sitting there crying because he hadn't come back. And it was a quarter of a mile from the highway up to the King Castle, at least, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And she told us, she said, "Yeah, he came in the house and said, 'Woman, heat me some water. I've been bitten by a rattlesnake. I got to go to the doctor.'" And she said, "I heated him some water, and he wouldn't let me look at where he got bit." And anyway, he got his very best clothes, and he put those on, and he took a suitcase, and he packed some stuff in there because he didn't know how long he'd be in the hospital, and he left. So we went down to Santaquin, or to Payson Sheriff's Office, and told them, and they got a search party out that night. And people were up there with their flashlights and their lanterns, and they were going through town, and the next morning there was a big search party, and then the guys went in one of the cafes to get something to eat, and it was around noontime, and they were telling about this guy, and the guy that runs the bus terminal would stop there. He said, "Oh, I saw that guy last night. He bought a ticket to Los Angeles." And so they checked to see what time it got into Los Angeles, and it would have already been to Los Angeles. So they got my dad, and they said, "We think he just left her." Just up and left her. And so they called off the search. And we let Esther live there, must have been another 6 months. And Dad would buy the food, and she was the watchman's wife. But he got a call from the Los Angeles County Sheriff Department, and they had this alcoholic that they'd picked up, and they were going to put him in jail. But if you'd take him back, we'll send the money. We'll buy the ticket to send him back. So Dad said, "Send him back." So they put him on the bus, and he got off at Santaquin. The bus driver had orders not to let him off till he got to Santaquin, and we were there to meet the bus. My dad told him, he said, "Emmett, I can kick your hind end all the way to China." He said, "You had us so upset. We were looking all over for you. We were hunting in the nighttime. We were hunting in the daytime." He said, "If those guys hadn't gone in and got coffee," he said, "we wouldn't have known you'd gone to Los Angeles." And he apologized, and he just wanted to change the scenery. So Dad said, "Well," he says, "you can stay here and work if you want, or if you want to go back to Salt Lake, I'll take you." He said, "I want to go back up to Salt Lake, and I want to take Esther with me." So they went to Salt Lake, and they were there quite a while. I don't remember how long it was, but I remember stopping in Dad's one night after work, and he said, "Oh, I've got the Kings back." He said, "I hired them back."
So he must have been making a little bit of money off the mining for being able to hire people, the miners and all that, huh?
Shareholders.
They'd sell stock. People that thought ore was there. My grandpa told a good story, and he had his machine that would tell a good story, but they never got any money out of it.
You know, speaking of Dad telling good stories, he put me to sleep at night when he'd be home just by telling me stories.
Yeah, he'd do the same thing to us.
I'll never forget that he told me that 2 kings were moving down onto the mine property and that he was building them a castle. He told me that the view they had from their castle was fit for a king. And I couldn't wait to meet not just one, but 2 kings. And I was so disappointed because they didn't have crowns, they didn't have purple robes with beautiful jewels. They were poor. I was the little boy, and just by looking at them, I knew they were tin can poor.
Yeah. Yeah, Dad bought all his food and clothes they needed, and I think he was paying them $1 a day. Might have been 2.
I think it was $1 a day each.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, because she would cook and then he'd work in the mines.
He didn't do much work in the mine. His lungs were bad. He was more of a watchman and clean up outside. I graduated in geology, and we were on a geology field trip, and we saw this coyote in a wash. And she just looked at us, and she acted like she was hurt. So we got some rocks, and we were going to kill her. And every time we get closer, she'd get a little bit better, and she'd run, and then she'd stop and lay down and turn in circles. And anyway, we kept after her, and pretty soon she just took off, and she ran along with her tail sticking up, just at a good old, like, I tricked you guys. And I said, I wouldn't be surprised if she's got a den back there. So we went back and we found 5 pups. And so we took those pups, and we got back up to BYU, and we were around the science building, and there were 5 of us, so we had 5 pups. And this one there at the science building got over too close, and it had you'd go up the steps, and there was a wall here that came down, and then below that you could walk underneath it. Well, she fell off of it, and well, the baby coyote fell off and landed on her head. That killed her. And so I took a coyote. Anyway, 4 of us took coyotes. And I took mine home and named it Baby. And I worked with that coyote and tried to train it like a dog because it was small. And my mom said one day, she says, you've got to get rid of that coyote. Every time my friends come in the house, she hisses at them. And they didn't like a coyote there. I'd take her on dates. I had an old 48 Studebaker, and I'd put her in the back window. And those Studebakers had that big window in the back and a big shelf. And she'd snap at cars as they'd go by. And she really had a good time, but it was a good way to get a date. You drive around with a coyote in your car. Yeah, we bought 100 chickens, and we were going to sell eggs. We figured if you buy 100 chickens, at least half are going to be hens and half going to be roosters.
Yeah.
We got those chickens. Turned out every one was a rooster. I don't know how they tell when they're that young. But, I mean, here's little chickens. And so we put them over the mine, and we had a chicken coop that we'd built for the hens, and we'd feed them, and Emmett's wife, she'd feed them, and they started getting bigger, and Dad said, what you going to do with those chickens? And we thought about it and said, he says, you just can't keep feeding them. He says, why don't you go down to Santa Quinn to the store and see if he'll buy them. If you'll pluck them and clean them, tell him you'll sell them a chicken for $1 a piece or some number like that. So we killed 2 chickens and did that. Went down to the store and told the man that we had 100 chickens that we'd bought, and that we couldn't keep them up there and feed them. We'd sell him as many chickens as he wanted till they was gone. And so we gave him the first 2 chickens. So he said, well, I'll take 4 a week from you. So 4 a week at whatever price we agreed on. And we decided that we'd let the chickens out of the chicken coop and would put their feet on the ground and they just get it outside. Then the coyotes started killing the chickens. And so Dad put a collar around his neck and chained him up to a post. And that coyote knew just how much space he had to get those chickens.
Oh, yeah?
And he'd lay back, and then when the chicken came in range, then he'd jump out and get her. You know, if the rope was 100 feet long, he'd lay back 25 feet.
Yeah.
So we decided to build hook him to the clothesline. Well, that gave him more slack because he could run along it. So then we decided to build a fence around him. And Dad had some of these metal fence posts you could pound down. So we pounded those down, and he had a whole bunch of chicken wire up there, so we put the chicken wire around it. And we ran out, so we went down to Payson to buy some more chicken wire. And we came back, and the coyote was hanging. And she had jumped the fence to get the coyotes. And the chicken wire was too high, and anyway, she couldn't hit the ground, and it hung her. So we lost the coyote, but yeah.
Well, I like those little tidbits. Those stories are great.
They are.
I got one more I'll tell you.
Let's hear it.
If you got time.
I got time. Let's hear it.
Actually, it's two more. But when my folks were working the Utah Galena shaft, which is north of Eureka and a little bit east, and just south of Chimney Rock, maybe a half mile. And Mom was pregnant with me, and so Dad built a cabin for my dad and my mom, and then he had a bigger bunkhouse for the miners, and then they had the hoist house, and then go up to the hoist and go down. But
I got pictures and all that.
Oh, cool.
The week before, my mom said that she wanted to make me some baby clothes. And she said she had a cedar chest, and she said, take my cedar chest into Provo. And she said, I'm going to stay in Provo the next week. So she was staying at my dad's mother's house and making these baby clothes and putting up some fruit. And some guys from Philadelphia had stock in the Utah Galena mine, and they had come out from Philadelphia, and they wanted to go over the mine. And my grandpa was away on a trip raising money, and anyway, she said that she would take him. But she says, I'm big and pregnant. And they said, well, that's okay. So they took her over the mine, and at that time, the road from Santa Quin to Eureka was dirt. And anyway, it was rough, and they smoked cigars, and it really made her sick. And when they got there, there was a sign on the door that said, gone to Eureka for supplies, back in 1 hour. So Mom reached up to get the key, and the key to the cabin was gone. She said, well, why would Vern take the key? So they sat outside in the shade of the cabin, and it went on quite a while, and they didn't come back. And so they said, we're going to go back to Provo. We don't think he's coming back. And my mom said, I can't ride with you. She said, I'm going to stay here and wait for Vern. So they said, okay. So they left her there, sitting on a chair outside the cabin. And she started to have labor pains. And of course it gets dark, and she's afraid and she's praying because she's there all alone, and my dad didn't come back. And pretty soon she heard a vehicle coming, and it was Lars Olsen, the guy that had the guy from Mexico go see my grandpa. And he came over to see how they were doing at the mine. He just had a whim to drive over there. So he picked her up and took her home. And when they get to the house, my dad's just loading up the truck, and he's over there in Provo. And he said, we ran out of money, so I put the sign on the door so nobody would rob us. So anyway, he drove over and got my mom and brought her back home. And that night, she had real bad labor pains, and I was born. So they didn't go over for a few weeks. It was like 3 or 4 weeks. Finally, they got enough money to be able to pay the miners and buy some groceries. They drove over there, and when they drove up on the dump, somebody had been there, and they had stolen the tin off the roof of both cabins.
Wow.
They had taken all of the siding off of both cabins.
Really?
They had taken all the furniture out of both cabins.
Wow.
There was 4 bunk beds in one and 2 full-size beds in the other. They made it so if Grandpa stayed that he could have one. But they'd taken that. There was a majestic range in each cabin. They were gone.
Wow.
They'd just taken everything.
Terrible.
Totally shut them down. It took a lot of money to get started again.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, my dad took a job selling sewing machines. But there was an old man, to me, named George Schulis. He was Greek. Some of the canyons over there, long canyons called Schulis Canyon. Anyway, he used to go to the miners. He was mining over there, and sometimes they'd get together at Allen's ranch, and Allen would kill one of his sheep, and he'd invite the miners in North Tinnick to come. And when we started working there, Dad would knock off at noon, and the miners would go home, and they had a truck or a car, and so it left the Jeep. So Dad asked Hort and me, he said, how would you boys like to go exploring? And we said, sure. So we started following the trails around that side of North Tinnick. We came out around this bend and out of a canyon, and here's this cabin sitting there, and it's made out of logs and railroad ties. And Dad said, I wonder if George is still alive. So he pulls up in front of this cabin, toots his horn, and dogs are barking, cats are running, chickens are making noises. And this guy came out of his cabin. To me, he was a big man. And he came out and started talking to my dad, they're old friends. And they were talking about mining and how, where we were working at the time. And George said, well, I'll have to come and see you. And he had 2 Model T coupes parked to the side of his house. And one of them is driving, and the other one he was using for parts. But he invited us in his cabin for a cold drink of water. And Hart and me were both amazed when we went in, because his walls were decorated with centerfolds from Playboy and what was before that, clear back to the early 1900s. And he had these women in their long bathing suits, you know, down below their knees. And then he had some Playboy pinups in there. And he said to us, he said, if you guys want to come over and stay, you're welcome to come over. I'll tell you about me. So we'd go over there, and he told us the neatest stories.
Oh, yeah?
And I think he was 14. He was drafted into the Greek army, and he didn't want to be in the army, but they got he and one of his friends, and his George did something, and they were going to execute him. And his firing squad was set for the next morning. And during the night, his friend was on guard duty, and he let him loose. And they went down to the piers, and they were loading one ship. And he said, so they stowed away on that ship. And it left the next day. Whenever the tide went out, they left. And they were on it a few days before they were caught. And they caught him, so they said that they had to work. So anyway, they put them to work doing jobs, but they said they'd pay him a wage. But he was on that ship with these sailors, and they were telling all the different stories to him, and he told us many of them, and I can't remember them. But when they got to New York, they pulled into New York, and they had to go to Ellis Island, and I think the Statue of Liberty was there then, because they let all the guys see the Statue of Liberty when they came in. And he got a job in New York doing something, and he didn't like it, and he'd heard about the Pony Express, and he decided he wanted to be a Pony Express rider. So he and his friend worked their way to St. Louis. And when they got to St. Louis, they told them that they were too big for the Pony Express, and besides, the Pony Express didn't exist anymore. And in some way, he and his friend got separated. So he started working his way west, and he'd get on at the freight lines, and then he got on with the stagecoaches that would go from wherever they were to little towns that are off the railroad line. And he ended up in Salt Lake, and the mining, he was interested in that, so we got down to Eureka. And he started working for a miner that had his mine, and that's where he learned how to mine. And then he found some more of his own, and he was working for the guy during the day, and then the nighttime he'd work on his own mine. But he was stacking it up out back of his cabin. And he went out one day, and two guys had jumped his claim. And they were working it, and they took off, and he was going to shoot them. And I guess he got liquored up, And he went into Eureka, walked into Eureka, and then he took the morning stage to Salt Lake. And he knew what hotel they were at. So it was raining going into Salt Lake. When he got out of the stage, he was onto the boardwalk that went down both sides of State Street and Main Street. And he checked his gun, make sure it was loaded, and as he stepped off the boardwalk to go across the street to this hotel, he was hit by lightning.
Wow.
Knocked him to the ground, and he was laying there with his eyes wide open. He could hear the people talking, and they said he was dead. And he said, I don't want to be dead. He said, Lord, I don't want to die if... That was the second bolt. He was laying there in the mud from the first one, and he said he started to tingle, and that he could move his legs, and they jumped back because they thought he was dead, and now he's alive. And anyway, they helped him up, got him back on the side of the street he was on. It burned the hair off his head, and they wanted him to get a hotel, and he said, I gotta kill those GD son of a bitches. And he walked across the street, and just before he stepped on the other side, he got hit again with lightning.
Really?
And he laid there, and he said his eyes were closed, and he could see, and he could hear, and the people were all gathered round. What do you do? What do you do? Here's this dead man. And that's when he said, Lord, I don't want to die. But I want to kill those sons of bitches that stole my claim. And people were gathered around, and he was still there. And then he said, Lord, if you don't want me to kill those sons of a bitches, I won't. And he said when that happened, that his toes started to tingle and his fingers started to tingle. And he could feel his extremities start to tingle. And then he could move them a little bit. And that's when they were, oh, he's alive, you know. And they got him up and they laid him on the boardwalk so he was out from under the lightning. And he could hear what they were saying. And he just told him, he said, I promise the Lord I won't kill him. I won't kill them sons of bitches. And so they helped him up. He got on the stagecoach back to Eureka and went out and went back to his claim, and those guys never came back.
Huh.
So,
You know, he had a lot of chickens.
yeah.
And from what I understand, he'd sell the chickens to the market in Eureka. And he'd pluck them and prepare them, but they'd go around and pick up all the little pebbles and such in their, what do they call it?
Gullet.
And there'd be a lot of gold
Really?
in the gizzard. At least
Yeah.
that's the story I heard.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not.
I think it's not, because he was going to tell Dad the location of his mine that he was getting the color out of, but Dad never got over there.
Well, what happened was when I got out of the Army, Dad let me take his truck, and I took Sharon, and we went over there, and I wanted to show her the places that I'd worked. And I going up through Shoeless Canyon, and the dogs came out. And I'd been in his cabin several times, and we'd stop there and get a drink of water. Never knew where he got his water. But he came out, And I used to think him as a big man, and this little man comes out, and he's on crutches, and he's got real thick glasses on. And I got out of the truck, and I went over and I said, "George, it's good to see you're still alive." And he said, "Who are you?" And I says, "You don't remember me?" And I smiled, and, "Oh, I remember you. How's your father?" He said, "You and your father are two of the honestest men I have ever known." And as I talked to him, I realized he thought I was my father, and that my father was his father. And then I told him, "No, oh, I remember telling you all these stories, you know." But he invited me in and shared for a glass of cold water, so we went in. He still got his cabin all decorated with these pin-up pictures. On one wall, the south wall, he had a great big tapestry that was hung over there. And I remember that tapestry. And he said, "You get your father to come and see me. Nobody knows where my mine is." And he said, "Your father's the only man I will give it to. You have him come out." And this was in the fall, because I got out in early October, and we went up there to pick some pine nuts. And so we went home, and I stopped by my dad's and told him that George was still alive. I said, "He's 107 years old. And he wants to tell you where his mine is. He doesn't think he's going to live much longer." And Dad says, "Well, I'll have to go see him this week." And he didn't see him. And then we picked a weekend I was going to go, and it snowed, and we didn't go. And then during the winter time, I read in the Daily Herald that one of Utah's oldest residents, George Schulis, had died at the age of 107.
Wow.
And it had an obituary about him on there. But that was one of those most unforgettable characters I ever met that the Reader's Digest used to put in their thing every month.
He had spittoons all around his cabin, and he could hit a spittoon 12 feet away.
Yeah. Yeah, he could get a wad and pew, and hit it. But that spring, after he died, we went over there, and somebody had burned down his cabin.
Terrible.
And it was burned right to the ground, but it opened up something. On the south side of his cabin, there was a shed that went into the ground. And a tunnel went back in the ground. So I got the flashlight, and we went back in that about 100 feet, and there was a dam back in there, and water was dripping down from outside. And the mountain, and it was going down and just dripping on the ground, and he had run a pipe through the bottom of it, and then he had that, and it was a cement dam that it had was about, I'm going to say 4 feet, might have been 3 feet high. And then he ran that pipe outside. I used to wonder how he had some trees there, a small orchard, how he watered his orchard and how he watered his chickens. And that's what he did. He'd collect that water, and there was enough for him and his orchard and his chickens.
Huh.
But it wasn't his mine that had the ore in it.
So they never did find his mine.
Nope.
Huh?
Nope. And I've looked on Google Earth trying to find all the mines over, and then we've ridden our four-wheelers over there, and anything that looked like it was a mine dump we've been to. Found a lot of neat ones, and but
Did you ever take a metal detector around where his cabin was or anything?
no. I'm sure somebody did. Well, I know somebody did, because we rode over there one day on four-wheelers, and there was a pickup truck there, and there were two couples, and they had metal detectors, and they wanted to know where his toilet was. They wanted to go down in the toilet. So I said, well, he moved it a lot. I mean, he'd dig a hole, and when it got full, he'd dig another hole and throw that dirt into it, and he moved it. I said, but I remember it started there, and the last time I saw it, it was over there. So
This is up in that kind of Allen Ranch Valley area?
yeah, south of Allen's Ranch. Yep.
Was there any story of anything being found in that little valley area anciently, not out of place archaeology type, not regular Indian, just, you know of any stories or anything?
Well, I know there were some mines there that produce, because that mine that where I was almost born, the shaft went down 777 feet, and then it had different levels that it would take off. And they got into, my dad was the superintendent of the mine, and he had a pretty good crew working for him. And they got into some real gravelly, bad stuff that they had to timber. And then they got a little further, and then they hit water. And so they built some ditches so the water could run over, and they were going to catch it before it went down and filled the rest of the hole up. And they went home for the weekend, and when they came back, they went down and they hit water. Water was filling the shaft, and it was a sulfur water, really, really bad smell. And they got some pumps and put in it, and they tried to pump the water out, but the pumps that they had couldn't keep up with the water. And I have no idea what level they had the pumps at, but
Is that where one of the miners was killed?
yeah.
I know that that was, Dad told me it was the confirmation of one of the superstitions miners had of not ever working your last day. And this was this miner's last day. The shift was over, they got on the lift cage, and they were headed up to the surface, and the cage stopped and jarred and bounced up and down on the cable. And after the second time it did that, this guy says, "I'm not staying on this," and he went over to the ladder to climb out of the cage, and the cage moved and knocked him off.
They went
and he fell
clear to the
all
bottom.
way down.
Yeah.
Wow.
Grandpa Peterson was the lift operator.
Was he?
Yeah. And it's right, the cable didn't go across nice like it should and come back, and it would build up on itself a little bit, and then it would slip down. And when they were coming up and go around, it would slip, and that would jar the thing. And the guy jumped off because he figured he'd take the ladders up, and he missed the ladders when he jumped off.
That decapitated him.
Wow.
Well, Neil, gosh,
I
I'd stay
appreciate
here
it.
all day and listen to you.
I appreciate it. No, I really do. Thank you, David, for arranging this.
I'm glad I know him.
Yeah.